A U.S. vice president walked into federal court, no lawyer, no defense, no shield of ceremony, and stood alone under the crushing weight of betrayal. This wasn't fiction. This wasn't a political drama crafted for streaming platforms. It was a cold Wednesday morning in D.C., and reality had decided to outpace imagination. It started as a whisper slithering through Capitol Hill's marble halls, and by the time the gavel struck, it was an earthquake splitting the Constitution. In real time, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, flanked by silence, cameras, and the full tension of a nation on edge, called for an emergency hearing with no notice, no protective buffers, no chance for anyone to rewrite the script. One line for the press: the Vice President is under investigation for withholding classified military files. And that was enough. The headlines didn't just report it. They screamed it. Vance faces national security breach allegation. Barrett drops legal bomb on executive branch. Then in the quiet that followed came the words that made half the country stop breathing. No one stands above the law, Barrett said. Not even the White House. It wasn't a press release, it was a shot across the bow, fired from the bench, and it hit like a detonation. And just when the spiral seemed too surreal to believe, JD Vance walked into that courtroom with no entourage, no counsel, no layers of strategy and spin. Just himself and a silence that the whole country wanted to fill with meaning. Let's be clear. When a man accused of betraying the Republic walks into court unguarded, armed not with a legal defense but with a single letter, you're either witnessing a breakdown or the kind of performance that leaves smoke in its wake. He didn't rant, didn't deflect, didn't call on the flags or wave the anthem. He reached into his jacket, and instead of pulling out a constitution, he laid something more dangerous onto the bench. A folded letter from a mother in Ohio. No fanfare, no flourish, no theater. Just quiet deliberation, the way one lays a photo. At a funeral when no one else has come. She didn't ask for justice, Vance said, voice low and heavy enough to make the microphones bend toward him. She asked for an answer, and suddenly the temperature in the room dropped. Not the air, but in Barrett's eyes. A woman trained to weigh truth without flinching, now blinking. Once, twice, like someone who'd just realized the document she had signed wasn't just a file, but a lie with casualties. This is the irony, isn't it? That the person assigned to uphold impartial truth is now shaken by a creased envelope. More honest than any legal brief ever submitted to her court, because truth, when it doesn't come wrapped in credentials or court documents, doesn't knock. It kicks the door down, but Barrett, to her credit, didn't blink for long. You don't climb to the highest court in the land by folding under pressure, even the kind that comes with the weight of the dead. She straightened her robe like armor, steeled her voice, and did what power does when cornered. She turned the process into a weapon. She didn't just respond with legal precedent. She came with a flamethrower dipped in Latin, ready to incinerate grief under the guise of jurisprudence. The court reminds all parties, she said, tone smooth and sterile, that under Article 24, combat-related decisions fall under executive immunity, unless criminal intent is explicitly proven. Translation? We can send your sons to die, and unless we lie about it with intention, you have no right to ask why. And just when you think the blade has been drawn, Barrett adds the twist. Out comes a psychiatric file, conveniently dated, perfectly, neutral in delivery. We submit medical documentation indicating a history of delusional episodes. Eleanor Harris, mother of the dead, was no longer a grieving parent. She was being painted as unreliable, mentally unwell. Her story nudged into the margins with surgical precision. It wasn't slander. It was suggestion, the kind of poison that makes headlines and crawls into public opinion like rot. Barrett never called her crazy. She just planted the idea that perhaps grief had made her memory unstable, that maybe truth was less fact and more reconstruction. It was genius, really. Sterile cruelty dressed in legal robes. The kind of performance that doesn't leave blood but bruises you can't see. Truth, Barrett said finally, does not require sympathy. It requires evidence. How convenient, how utterly perfect for power. To define truth as something that can only be proven by the same systems that buried it in the first place. Vance didn't argue. He didn't shout. He didn't even speak. He waited. Because when A mother enters a courtroom with no badge, no backing, no privilege, only memory. Truth doesn't need a lawyer. It just needs to be heard. The door opened without flourish, just wide enough for breath to leave the room. She stepped in, not with fanfare, but with the kind of weight that makes an entire building lean toward her presence. Eleanor Harris, no ID, no lawyer, no warning. No one had called her name, but every head turned. A red coat wrapped around a frame too small for the truth she carried. She didn't march to the bench, didn't pause for permission. She walked to the center like a storm that didn't need thunder to be known. Her eyes didn't search for sympathy. They landed where they belonged, on Barrett. And when she spoke, it wasn't accusation or demand. It was something far sharper. "I'm not here to blame anyone," she said, each syllable a chisel against the courtroom stone. "I'm here to ask a question. If my son believed in this country until his final breath, why did this country hide his death from his own mother? No tremble, no theatrics, no breakdown, just a voice carved from grief that had lived too long in silence. It hit the room with the precision of a burial stitch. Tight, final, unforgiving. "I buried my daughter 3 years ago," she continued. "She didn't die from disease. She died of fury. Fury at how Matthew was treated. Like a typo." Eyes dropped. Even those trained to remain impassive found their gaze falling to the floor. Not Barrett. But Eleanor didn't need her to look. "I kept wondering," she said, quieter now, more deadly. "If a soldier dies because his name was switched, who's responsible? The one who signed, the one who didn't check, or the one who stayed silent?" She paused then, her stare burning into the place where truth had once lived before it was sold. "You think honor is defined by code. We think it's hearing my son's name said properly. The reason he died said truthfully, and the name of who signed the order that killed him. Said out loud." The room seemed to collapse inward. Air thinning with each word. "I don't need your apology. I want to know, of all the documents you've signed, did you ever read the name at the bottom of the last page? In the back?" A staffer rose. No one signaled. Then another stood. And another. It wasn't protest, it wasn't performance. It was the silent agreement of people who knew what it meant to finally stand when no one else could. Eleanor stepped down. No smile, no tears. Just one final sentence. "I'm not asking for justice. I just want this country, for once, to hear the whole story." She had barely returned to her seat when Vance stood again. No one called him. He didn't speak to the cameras. He didn't speak to Barrett. He just carried a file so thin it could have been ignored, yet heavy enough to rupture the room. "There's one chapter missing," he said. "Let's finish it." He walked to the bench, set it down, not with defiance, but with the same solemnity of someone placing a weapon at the altar. Calm, irreversible. The cover plain. The first page. Operation Hollow River. Approved disbursement. $3.22 million. Category: psychological stabilization. These. Signature: Amy Coney Barrett. The air didn't move. Not even sound dared exist. Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This isn't a footnote," he said. "It's a budget directive. Executed. Paid. A contract embedded in the same mission that ended Matthew Harris's life." He flipped the next page outward. The ink was clear. The name undeniable. "So tell me, Your Honor, was this oversight or hush money and therapeutic wrapping?" Barrett looked down, eyes locked on the page. No rebuttal, no outrage. Only the kind of pause that couldn't be spun with talking points. Then she replied, flat, mechanical, like a machine forgetting how to breathe. "I signed hundreds of those." Vance's voice dropped into something colder. "That's what makes it terrifying." Barrett didn't argue. She recalibrated. She tapped her mic once, summoning Department of Justice presence. "Unauthorized classified content is being disclosed without review," she said. And with that, the room shifted. The hearing was no longer a court. It was now a security breach. Screens froze. Audio cut. A technician darted toward the controls. Barrett straightened her robe. Not in panic, but with the precision of someone choosing a new battlefield. "This is not theater," she said. "This is a court of law, and in courts, emotion is not admissible." Her tone had turned metallic. "The operation in question, Hollow River, was approved under national contingency. Its psychological fallout, however tragic, does not invalidate the mission's legality. Then she looked at Vance, her voice steadier than ever. You've humanized a process that was never meant to be personal. But war isn't written in sentiment. History isn't made from tears. It's made of statutes. The air crackled, not from emotion, but from realization. Barrett wasn't denying death. She was redefining it, folding it into cold scaffolding so sterile it could freeze the truth itself. Then came the blow that didn't roar, but rang like finality. I move to strike the previous exhibit on the basis of classified breach, Barrett announced, her voice sharp as a gavel, and recommend the Vice President be referred to the Department of Justice for potential misconduct involving federal records. The declaration wasn't debated. It was delivered, like a locked vault falling from a height. But Vance didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Instead, he reached once, more into his folder, not for more paper, but for something smaller, darker, and infinitely louder. A flash drive. Since we're in the business of referrals, he said, let's not forget the kind that comes with receipts. He handed it to the technician. Fingers flew over keys. The screen blinked, and then it played. A voice. Calm, clipped, authoritative, spilled into the room like acid on silk. If the family presses, it said, cite tactical breach. That shuts it down. Always does. The silence that followed wasn't from disbelief. It was from recognition. Some gasped. Others simply stared at Barrett, waiting. Not for a denial, but for the machinery of defense to grind into motion. Vance leaned forward just slightly. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? He asked, his voice not loud but carved from granite. Barrett didn't move at first. Then she spoke, measured, dismissive. That recording is manipulated, spliced. AI can do wonders. But the technician didn't even look up. He tapped a screen and stated clearly for the record, chain of custody confirmed. Raw file, no edits, no compression, full waveform integrity. The weight shifted. Vance's tone remained the same, but now the ground beneath it cracked. That's the problem with recorded truth, he said. It doesn't care about clearance levels, it just plays. And then, quieter still, like something eternal being unburied, and now, so will the consequences. Barrett's fingers moved, not with confidence but with memory. She reached for a folder like a magician retrieving a hidden card, but this time the move didn't dazzle. It reeked of desperation. Let the record reflect, she began, that in 2014 Vice President Vance contacted lobbying, affiliates tied to a military contractor now under investigation. He sought access, funding, and a seat at the table. There it was, the classic Washington pivot. Caught in one lie, answer with another. A decade-old email, freshly printed, waved like scripture. You wanted in, Mr. Vance, she said, voice rising ever so slightly. Now that you've been locked out, you call the system corrupt. She wasn't finished. Her tone shifted again, no longer judicial, almost confessional. I warned you, she said, locking eyes with him. I said it to your face. If you go against the system, you will never win. It wasn't a legal argument. It was a coded threat finally spoken aloud. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't a battleground. It was a whispered map of a world the public never gets to see. A place where gatekeepers aren't evil, just practiced. Corruption wasn't the denial of virtue. It was the price of admission. And she had just confirmed the price. Outside the courtroom, cable news devoured the moment. The country split in two. To some, Vance was a fallen believer, a man burned by the altar he once worshipped. To others, he was a cynical insider turned martyr. Only after his invitation got revoked. But those debates didn't matter, not really. Because in her attempt to discredit him, Barrett had unintentionally revealed the real currency of Washington. Proximity. Proximity to power. Proximity to silence. And what happens when the wrong person finally gets too far from both? And then came the next witness. Not a lawyer, not a politician, a nurse, Susan. Her walk was quiet, steady, the kind of stride forged from late nights in trauma rooms, holding hands that never got to let go. She took the stand like someone who had nothing to win and too much to remember. Matthew Harris, she began. He was brought in after the blast, chest wounds, shrapnel, shock. She paused, not because she forgot, but because the room needed to absorb it. But he was conscious. 27 minutes. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, he just whispered. Her voice softened. Does my mom know I wasn't supposed to be here? Barrett didn't speak, but her breath did. It changed. And Vance? His hand moved to one last file. A personnel manifest. 2 names, 1 order. BR-91, he said. Original slot, Nicholas Caleb Barrett. Final deployment, Matthew James Harris. He placed the paper down. They didn't die together. Just in sequence. The courtroom didn't gasp, it froze. Because a swapped name isn't a clerical error. It's a death sentence signed in ink. And when the system rewrites a death, it doesn't just change a record. It changes history. Vance stood silent. The paper between them didn't accuse. It revealed, and sometimes, that's worse. She didn't flinch, but she didn't breathe either. Barrett sat at the bench, her spine straight, her eyes locked not on the paper, but on the space just beyond it, as if the truth had finally become too large to stare at directly. It wasn't denial. It was something colder. Suspension, like a clock stopping in mid-tick. The courtroom held its breath, not because of protocol, but because something sacred had just been unboxed. And then Vance pulled one last item from his jacket, a single yellowed sheet of paper. The edges were creased like it had been folded 100 times, carried too far, too long. She gave me this letter, he said quietly. Not to read during arguments, but to read when this nation was finally willing to listen. His voice wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It was steady, like a tide that had finally reached the shore. Truth, he read, is not for revenge. It's the only thing left that lets the living begin to heal. My grandson doesn't need someone to pay for what happened. He just needs a country brave enough to say his name right. He looked up. The paper in his hand seemed to move with his breath, as if alive. She wasn't asking for punishment, he said. Just acknowledgement, not just for Matthew. For every name this system filed wrong. Like paperwork. He folded the letter with care, each crease deliberate, and placed it on the desk. Not as evidence, but as a returning of memory to its rightful place. Across from him, Barrett remained still, as if any movement would confirm her role in what had been unearthed. 9 rounds of testimony hadn't moved her, but this piece of handwritten memory, shattered something. Her eyes didn't drop, but the first tear did. It hit her hand silently, not like defeat, but like someone who had finally heard every word they'd spent years avoiding, and no one spoke. No one dared slice through the silence with legalese or theater, because sometimes justice doesn't need to roar. It just needs someone to pick up the name it forgot and put it back where it belongs. The courtroom collapsed, inward, not in chaos but in stillness, the kind of stillness you don't dare disturb. A breath moved through the room, low and shared, as if the entire nation was remembering how to inhale without guilt. And then someone stood, not a witness, not a politician, just a man. He said nothing as he stepped forward, but his walk carried the weight of someone who had lost more than time. He approached Vance, didn't look at the judge, didn't glance at the cameras. He simply pointed at the paper on the desk. That order, he said, killed him. Still no outcry, still no panic. Just a truth being spoken where silence had once been sacred. I was in the unit, he continued. I saw the original manifest. I saw the name, Barrett. Then I woke up the next day and that name was gone. In its place, Matthews. Every gaze turned to the file, not to see it, but to finally understand its cost. The change came through at 2:47 a.m., 12 hours before deployment. No tactical shift, no swap of duties. Just a name, switched. Then he turned, not with rage, but with a stillness so complete it hurt. I'm not here to indict you, he said. I'm here to remind you, if a system chooses the wrong man to die, it's not just flawed. It forfeits its right to call itself a system at all. And then came the last strike, sharp, quiet, and devastating. The signature on that order wasn't anonymous. It belonged to the Chief of Staff to Justice Amy Coney Barrett. He didn't need to raise his voice. Every syllable landed like iron dropped into water. No one on the jury moved. Not out of decorum, but because they had just witnessed something holy. A soldier had kept his oath, while others signed theirs away long ago. Then Vance stepped to the center of the room, holding not evidence, not judgment, something more mundane and more sacred. A kitchen chair, worn wood, chipped at the kind of object that never makes it into courtrooms, and yet today it was the only thing that belonged. "This chair," Vance said, "belonged to Matthew." He placed it beside the witness stand with care, like setting a place for the dead at a table where they should have always had a seat. His grandmother kept it in the same spot for 3 years, because she believed that one day America would need it more than it needed any ruling. He stepped back. No flourish, no dramatics, just truth returned to its rightful seat. What happened next wasn't prompted. Each witness who followed glanced at the chair before they spoke, like the room had gained a new axis of gravity. Some leaned toward it unconsciously, as if the truth now lived there. And then came a boy, shirt too big, hands trembling, metal in his grip. Caleb Barrett, 11 years old, son of Nicholas. The man who never went, the name that never made it to the ground. He walked to Vance, not to the bench, not to the press. "You didn't replace my dad," he said, "but you said the thing." He never got to. Then he lifted the medal and placed it into Vance's palm. "My dad told me medals aren't about honor. They're reminders for those who survive, of who they're still living for. No tears, no ceremony, just a sentence that could break stone. Justice doesn't need to speak loudly. It just needs someone willing to sit in the empty chair." The cameras turned toward Vance, expecting a speech, a declaration, some grand finale to the unfolding drama, but he said nothing. He didn't raise his head. He didn't take the moment. He bowed it, not in triumph, but in reverence, as if the truth wasn't something to claim, but something to grieve. The jury didn't need prompting to stand. They rose slowly, not out of duty but understanding, because something irreversible had been spoken into the air, and sitting through it felt like desecration. On that day, America didn't deliver a verdict. It chose to listen. And in that silence, dense, suffocating, holy, a single figure moved. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't a plaintiff. It wasn't even a judge anymore. It was Barrett. She stepped forward, not as a justice, not as the final voice of the highest bench, but as someone who had just realized they had carried something toxic for too long. Her movements were unsure, like a person suddenly aware of the weight they'd grown used to. Some truths don't exist to be defended. They exist to make us remember how to breathe again. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was whole. "I changed that name," she said. No preamble, no soft landing, just the fact, ripped bare and placed on the floor between them. No deliberation, no vote. "I did it because I was afraid." The courtroom didn't shift. It locked in. Barrett's eyes moved. Not to Vance, not to the jury, but to the file on the bench, where Matthew J. Harris's name rested beside the signature no one could now unsee. "I was afraid of losing my nephew." The truth, at last. Not the version in press releases or memos, but the one so raw it hurt to speak. "But that wasn't the only fear," she added. Her voice didn't shake. That was the worst part. It was steady, resigned, as if the real crime had been normalized long ago. "I was afraid that if I didn't protect my own blood, people would think I was weak. Not the public, but the people behind the curtain. The ones who decide what operational necessity really means. The ones who know how to clean a conscience with a redacted document." This wasn't an apology. It was the sound of a system coughing up its deepest infection. Politics doesn't reward decency. It rewards survival. And when survival becomes your only metric, right and wrong turn into myths you recite for the cameras. She paused. Not from guilt. From exhaustion. "I don't know when I lost the line," she admitted. "I just know one day I stopped asking if the thing I was signing still resembled justice." Her gaze met Vance's, and for the first time, it wasn't a contest. It wasn't courtroom war. It was human. "We don't lose our ethics all at once," she said. "We surrender them, one decision at a time. by calling them something else. There was no applause, no release of tension, just a sound, a collective breath, the kind a country takes when it realizes it has survived, but forgotten who died to make that survival possible. Barrett stepped back from the bench then, her fingers letting go of the edge like she wasn't just stepping away from her position, but from everything that had kept her upright. No one told her she had to. She just knew. She no longer had the right to sit there. Morality doesn't die in a single night, and it doesn't come back with a single confession. It takes something more, something harder, a collective refusal to accept sanitized silence. And in that room, on that day, not a soul remained seated. The jury returned. No hesitation, no glancing around. Just 12 people carrying the weight of a country's conscience. They didn't stand to condemn a key person. They stood to reset the order. The spokesperson stepped forward. Their voice didn't crack, it didn't waver. It didn't need to. This panel does not recommend criminal prosecution, they said. But we find, with the evidence presented, that the conduct in question is anti-justice. The words fell like stones into water. They weren't dramatic. They were deliberate. We recommend immediate resignation, not for personal dignity, but for the dignity of the court. And no one, not a single juror, looked at Barrett, because by that point this wasn't about her. It was about the robe, the role, the silence she had chosen to wear like armor. Outside, the crowds hadn't left. They hadn't burned flags or shattered glass. They hadn't screamed vengeance. They stood together, one voice, one condition. Resign or remember. Not a threat, a moral requirement. A final line in the sand from a public too tired to wait for justice written in legal ink. Placards held a single sentence. Hashtags echoed the same. Even live news coverage had shed its panels and filters for the truth stripped bare. Justice was not blind. It was complicit, and now it had to step aside. No one shouted the words. No chants filled the streets. Instead, people wrote them, taped them, etched them, onto courthouse doors, onto sidewalks, into memory, not because they needed to win, but because they needed the truth to outlast the lie. At that precise moment, something subtle but irreversible shifted in the marrow of the country. For all the pages of law and mountains of precedent, what endured wasn't written by scholars or signed with titles. It came from the people who had simply had enough. And somewhere far from the courtroom, in a quiet public classroom in Cincinnati, Ohio, the last lesson of the day was wrapping up. A teacher stood at the front of the room, beneath a U.S. map and a quote from the Constitution. At the center of the board, taped gently at the corners, was a single photograph. No caption, no decoration, just a young man's face in uniform, Matthew J. Harris, age 22, eyes too alive to have known such an ending. The teacher didn't need to introduce him. The class already knew. "Can anyone tell me what honor means?" she asked, her voice soft, like someone who had learned that some truths aren't taught. They're remembered. Hands rose. A boy answered, "It means doing good." Another followed, "Keeping your promises." A third chimed in, "Fighting for your country." Then from the last row a quiet voice broke through. A girl, dark hair falling over her pencil, said without looking up, "Honor means telling the truth even when everyone else is lying." No one corrected her. No one laughed. The teacher looked at the photo. She nodded. Not because the answer was polished, but because the lesson had finally landed where it needed to. Across the country, in Washington, D.C., the light in the Oval Office had begun to dim. No ceremony. No press conference. Just JD Vance standing alone at the desk, surrounded by stacks of unsigned memos. Beside them sat a single object untouched, the silver medal placed in his hand by Caleb Barrett. He didn't lift it. He didn't hold it to the light. He simply looked at it as if the silence around it was finally louder than any speech he could make. There were no advisors, no staffers. Only a whisper, barely audible, not spoken for cameras or history books, just for conscience. "We didn't win," he said. But at least the truth was heard. The world outside didn't pause. School bells still rang. Headlines still rolled across screens. The flag still waved. But somewhere, in that small classroom, A child had just learned something America had almost forgotten. Justice isn't a seat in a courtroom. It's a lesson that must never be unlearned. And the cost of forgetting it was written in a name that had to be spoken again and again until the silence broke. Justice, as it turns out, doesn't always arrive with a verdict. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a single seat placed beside a witness stand, a kitchen chair that shouldn't have belonged in any federal chamber, but did, not because of design, because of absence, because someone was missing who never should have been. And in that absence, a country found its conscience, not in the laws it passed, but in the voice of a grieving grandmother, a hesitant judge, a boy with trembling hands, and a soldier who remembered the truth long after the system had chosen to forget it. Barrett never asked for forgiveness. She didn't fall to her knees. She didn't beg. What she did was more unsettling. She admitted it. No caveats, no damage control, just the raw admission that she had traded her ethics for the illusion of strength. Not because she was evil, but because the world behind the curtain had taught her that morality was expendable if survival was on the line. And in saying so, she exposed something far more damning than any memo or recording ever could. That the real danger isn't bad actors. It's good people trained to betray themselves by degrees. When the jury recommended her resignation, it wasn't to punish her. It was to rescue the idea that justice should mean something again. Not perfect, just honest. Not loud, just whole. And as she stepped down, not by force, but because she knew she had to, it wasn't the end of her legacy. It was the beginning of something rarer. Accountability that came too late but still mattered. That kitchen chair remained in the courtroom for days. No one moved it. Even after the room emptied, after the cameras were packed away, it sat there, like a reminder, plain, quiet, and unmoving. Some came to look. Others came just to sit in silence, but all left knowing that something had changed. Because in a nation used to forgetting its dead, someone finally chose to remember. Not with statues, with names, not with noise, with truth. And in the end, that was enough to begin again.